does gold hold its value now? I can never understand it. I mean, apart from bling and dentists and things,
Yeah.
what's the point of gold if we don't have it as a standard? And yet it still seems to be immensely valuable.
Well, in part it does have industrial uses and jewelry, but of course it's gone up a lot as an inflation hedge. Right? So people run into it as something that the value of which won't be inflated away, unlike bonds. Right? So it's an alternative in that way. Now, it's a lot more volatile now that it's been demonetized. Right? It goes up and down with every rumor and every hunch about how much inflation is going to go up or down, or whether there's going to be a crisis where the bonds are not paid back. So bad news of whatever type tends to make the price go up, and good news makes it settle back down again. But I mean, that's how I read it. People are acquiring it as an inflation hedge. And there's kind of an irony here, because the argument for leaving the gold standard that had a lot of power among economists like Milton Friedman, who advocated leaving the gold standard, was you could have just as good a monetary policy without incurring all these costs of digging up gold and then storing it in vaults. Right? Ironically, when the price of gold is at $1,800, it's more valuable than it was under the classical gold standard. Right? The real price of gold has gone up, and that means more resources are being devoted to gold mining, which is good for Western Australia and other gold producing places, but it is a resource cost. So the resource cost has actually gone up.
Professor White, you have a reputation for views on free banking, implying,
that happens when you write a book with that phrase in the title.
As I understand it, you are not actually in favor of central banks.
That's correct.
Can you give us a quick resume of that?
Okay, so the argument in my first book, Free Banking in Britain, is largely historical. Namely, I look at banking systems before central banks came on the scene, and in particular I look at the Scottish banking system before it was restricted in 1844. And I find it worked really well. Instead of one agency having monopoly on the issue of hand-to-hand currency, all the banks, all the major banks, issue hand-to-hand currency. You can still see a kind of relic of that in Scotland and Northern Ireland and Hong Kong, where there's still private note issue. But when it's on a gold standard, it means that you economize on gold because people substitute paper currency. But you want some way to constrain the paper currency from being overissued. And it turns out competition does a very good job of that. A bank that issues more than other banks is going to lose gold reserves, and so it's going to have to stop. And the system as a whole will lose reserves to the rest of the world, so that has to stop. Whereas when you put a central bank in charge of the gold standard, the constraints become much looser. They can make the money supply go through much bigger gyrations and the economy go through much bigger business cycles. So that's the argument in a nutshell. Now, when you're under fiat money, you can't really eliminate the central bank. Somebody's got to control the quantity of fiat money. So the application of free banking theory as a monetary policy to the current day is a little dicier, but I think it gives us some hints.
First of all, thank you for a very eloquent exposition. Now, my question is, China. There's no mention of China in that.
There's no chapter on China.
So I'm kind of curious, especially because you have mentioned about India. There's a chapter on India. And from my point of view, India and China started about the same time. India in 47, China in 48. And there is a lot of similarities between them. At that time, both agrarian, both had vast population, poor, and badly literate. So it would have been, I'm just curious, why do you pick India and Germany, which before had an industrial, and it was developed before war. I mean, German rocket technology was the best in the world and so on. But China and India were similar. And they both went into India socialism, China sort of communist form of government. So why did you choose, or are you keeping it for your next book?
Well, the short answer is there's a lot of literature on India that's in English, and I don't read Chinese. But the focus of the book is on the debates, right? It's on the ideas behind the policies. And the debate in China has all been behind closed doors. It's not like there are journals in which economists are publishing opposing views to one another. So there really wasn't going to be much to work with in the case of China.
With the rise of globalization, it seems that states have lost their control over much that goes on anyway. If you're keen on free banking and we're keen on free markets, it seems to me that there's nothing to stop two parties, A and B, who want to trade, of using any money-based system, commodity-based system that they want. So do you believe that, that over time, as markets use their wisdom, that they will abandon these fiat money systems and go through to some system which will be more efficient on some sort of commodity-based process?
Well, so there are two issues here. One is, should people be free to use whatever currency they want? And I think absolutely yes.
They are free.
Well, and in most places, the legal barriers are pretty small. You're right. In most places, banks, in the United States at least, banks are free to open checking accounts for you in Swiss francs. But there isn't much demand for it. So the second issue is, would this happen? And there's a great incumbency advantage in currency, network effect, it's the technical term. People want to use the money that their grocery store will accept. And the grocery store won't accept Swiss francs if they can't pay their wages in it. And so there's kind of a chicken and egg problem for anybody who wants to be the first one on his block to go back on the gold standard. Now, I don't want to oversell the difficulties. We do see spontaneous switches in currency use. We see them in Latin America all the time. If the local currency gets bad enough, people will go to an existing currency and it'll spread into their country. People will dollarize themselves. But gold is at a bigger disadvantage than that because it's been completely demonetized. So there's nowhere that gold is being used as a medium of payment in any common way. I mean, there are some projects people have to have a gold-based currency with internet accessible bank accounts, but they're pretty small. And the leading purveyor of these services was eGold until they got raided by the US government to shut them down as though they thought that this was serious competition. And they shut them down on the pretext that they were running a money transfer service without the proper licenses, right, which Western Union had lobbied for to limit the competition.
I think Zimbabwe is a good example of transition from a crap currency to the US dollar. I won't comment on the US dollar. It's a substantial amount of good in shifting the economy to something quite different from what it was before.
There's a theory that the American economy runs on a war economy. What's your belief in that?
I hope not. I mean, I think of the war sector or the defense sector as a drain on the economy, not as an engine of economic prosperity. You spend real resources building stuff and then you blow it up. And that doesn't really accumulate capital. That's not the way to economic growth.
Yeah.
Professor White, you've talked mainly of two economic theories, which is the Keynesian theory, where a bigger role of government, and also the monetarist, a stable money supply. The third theory is a more recent one, is the supply side economics, that attacks and incorporating four areas: regulatory, tax policy, of course also government borrowing, and a stable money supply. That's not, is that covered in your book at all?
I do have a section on the supply side arguments and the role they played in the Reagan deficits. I defend the supply siders in the Reagan administration against having the view that all tax cuts will pay for themselves. Some people were quite explicit that they're not going to pay for themselves, but we want them anyway because we want to shrink the government.
So it's selective tax cuts, you would?
Yeah, I mean, some taxes are beyond the peak of the Laffer curve, others are not.
Having observed the clash of economic ideas over the last 100 years, what conclusions have you drawn about the influence of ideas, if any, on economic policy?
That's a good idea. I mean, good question. There are kind of two views you can take. One is that ideas matter, and the other is ideas don't matter. It's just window dressing for special interests. And Pareto had that view. He said, look, if you're a policymaker, you can choose whatever economic theory you like, and once you say, this is my policy, the academics will line up and provide you with all the rationales you want for the policy you're going to pursue anyway. And there are some examples of that in process, but there are many examples I talk about in the book where academics came down from the ivory tower with ideas and they changed policy. So I think ideas, for better or worse, really do matter. An example of for worse is the New Deal in the United States. The idea that you could restore prosperity by creating cartels to restrict output. And if restricting output as a way of getting out of a Great Depression seems like a crazy idea. It is a crazy idea, but it was an idea of a group of academics who sold it to Franklin Roosevelt.
Recently I saw a graph of inflation in New Zealand, which probably wouldn't be greatly dissimilar from one in Australia. And it's from 1860 to the present. And you can see from about 1860 to 1934, when the Reserve Bank of New Zealand was apparently created, inflation is pretty stable and, you know, in some cases even declining. Ever since then, it's just been going up and up and up and up.
We have the same graph in the US.
Yeah, I would say so. It sort of suggests that the performance of central banks has been pretty abysmal.
That's right.
Would we be better off going back to a gold standard?
I think so, provided we also abolish the central bank.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I actually have a serious academic paper with two co-authors, George Selgin and Bill Lestraps, where we try to gather all the evidence, mostly previously published by other people, but we try to sort of synthesize it and in a few places extend it, judging the performance of the Federal Reserve System. Clearly they don't do well on the claim that they've stabilized the value of money, but they're often defended on the grounds that they've made the economy more stable. They've reduced the fluctuations of the business cycle. And we find that that's actually not true. The economy isn't any more stable under their stewardship than it was before 1913, when the U.S. had a really bad banking system, so there were financial troubles. But they've sort of been working with a more diversified economy, so performance ought to look markedly better, but it doesn't look any better. So they failed even at the tasks that they're usually given credit for. And that's even if you take out the Great Depression period, right? So that was just practice. Okay? Take that out and just look at their post-war performance, and it's not better than under the classical gold standard before the Federal Reserve Act in 1913.
I'd like to return to your comment earlier about the ultimate, where people wish to live at the expense of everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
And I noticed that under the George W. Bush period, the debt levels had risen.
Yes, it did.
Despite the rhetoric that's going on presently between Republicans and Democrats, neither really address the issue of everyone's living at somebody else's expense.
That's right.
Australia's debt levels have risen considerably, and yet the general demeanour here is, oh well, government will sort it out. The nanny state process continues and grows, and it grows on both sides of the political fence. So the question I ask is, how do you start a debate with ideas in an environment with both sides of the political fence are locked into a situation where it'll continue to go on? Now, you're making a lot of comments, but the debate is not happening really about, you see the debt rising, and I had the privilege of spending a bit of time with Walker, who used to be the Controller General of the United States, who now has a website focused on just this issue so how do you start a debate?
Well, I'm a little more optimistic about the debate being underway than you are. We have this phenomenon in the U.S. called the Tea Party. And before the Tea Party, there was something called the Concord Coalition, which was worried about debt and deficits. So there are people making these arguments, and in academia, there's certainly a debate. I mean, economists like Sargent and Robert Barrow have sort of, and Gary Becker are sort of doing the heavy hitting, making the case in books and columns for sort of fundamental reform. You're certainly right that the George W. Bush administration allowed the debt to swell. They instituted free pills for everybody. That was a big expense. They mounted expensive wars. That made the debt rise. But it did spark protest within the Republican Party, and there's a battle going on for the soul of the Republican Party. And of course, Ron Paul is kind of a bellwether of that. And Ron Paul's supporters are mostly young, and so it gives me some hope that maybe in a generation the Republican Party will stand for something.
Okay, well, I think one last question. Thanks.
Where do you see the euro in the near term? Do you see it collapsing? What's your prognostication?
I see it getting weaker and weaker. I mean, the central bankers who run the euro are aware that inflation is a potential problem. Even though the German member resigned in disgust a couple of years ago over their decision to violate their constitution, there's a new German member, so there are some voices of restraint. So I don't anticipate hyperinflation, but double-digit inflation is a possibility if it comes down to a choice between that and massive sovereign defaults. So I see a weaker euro ahead.
Well, I guess we can finish on a down note then. Look, I think we've had
Stronger Aussie dollar ahead.
Since I go to Europe, yeah, why not? I think we've had a wonderful exposition, and I urge everyone, obviously, to get a copy of Larry's book. One, you can get the first 5 chapters, which we didn't hear about tonight, and there's a lot more detail, I'm sure, in the rest of the chapters. It's a sort of fight or a period that, of interest to us. I mean, I'm a member of the Montpellier Society. And I know a lot of the pictures that flashed up on the screen I've dealt with and known over the years. I think Stigler, by the way, thought that interest mattered more than ideas.
That's right.
Yeah. So I can sort of remember some discussions with him and so on. So look, I think it's been wonderful for us to. Larry's here for a conference in Melbourne, but he was able to break and fly up to Sydney, especially to come and talk to us tonight. So on behalf of you all, thank you very much, and please join with me.